meeting will be recorded and it will be posted to our website. Can I get a thumbs up from someone if you see the presentation? Perfect. All right, this is tag 5 for Washington. This is our final tag meeting unless there's a need for a 6th tag meeting. This tag meeting is basically wrapping up everything that's been discussed in the first 4 tag meetings into a final modeling process. So I'll go on to the next slide if it will let me. There we go. So in a moment, we'll do introductions. I'll have a quick safety moment. I'll touch on the stakeholder engagement document. We'll have an overview.
Hey, Brian, I think you hit your mic or your mute button.
Thanks. Sorry about that. Whenever it's on Teams and I hit enter to change the slide, sometimes it'll mute me. Did you guys hear any of the agenda slide, or should I start
Just heard
over?
the introductions. I just start over.
Okay. So I'll do safety moment, stakeholder engagement. We'll do load forecast, backcast. So we'll look at how the load forecast has performed. A summary of alternative resources, components of candidate portfolio. We'll talk stochastic methodology, scenario and sensitivity results. We'll discuss the proposed 2-year action plan, and then we'll talk about the remaining timeline for this IRP and the next steps. So we'll do introductions. I'll go down the list. I'll introduce myself first. I'm Brian Robertson, Supervisor of Resource Planning with Cascade. Pam?
Yes, Pam Archer, Regulatory Analyst, Cascade.
Bruce?
Good morning, Bruce Folsom, IRP Consultant for Cascade.
Carrie?
Good morning, Carrie Buren, Energy Efficiency Supervisor, Cascade.
Thanks, Carrie. Corey Dahl?
Sorry, I had trouble unmuting there. This is Corey Dahl from the Washington Attorney General's Office, Public Counsel Unit.
Thank you, Corey. Monica?
Good morning, Monica Collishaw, Cascade's Energy Efficiency Department.
Ashton?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ashton Michael Davis. I'm economist with Cascade.
Thanks, Ashton. Gabe?
This is Gabe Forster. I am Manager of Environmental Compliance and Sustainability with MDU.
Gabe. Byron?
Hello, I'm Byron Harmon. I'm a regulatory analyst with the Washington UTC.
Byron. Kim?
Hi, Kim Herb. I'm the Utility Strategy and Planning Manager at the Oregon PUC.
Thanks, Kim. Hai Xiao?
My name is Hai Xiao Huang, economist with Northwestern Natural.
Devin?
Hey, good morning, everyone. Devin McReel, Senior Resource Planning Analyst with Cascade. Thank you all for joining us.
So, Mike?
Hey, good morning. Mike Parvinen, Regulatory for Cascade.
Caleb?
Yeah, good morning. Caleb Reimer, Economic Analyst with Cascade.
Chris?
Good morning, Chris Robbins with our gas supply and gas control groups at Cascade.
Chris, Mark.
Good morning. This is Mark Sellers-Vaughn, Manager Supply Resource Planning with Cascade.
Zach.
Yep, Zach Sowards with Engineering Services, Montana Dakota Utilities Group.
Zach. Carolyn.
Carolyn Stone, Gas Supply at Cascade.
Great. Sebastian.
Yeah, hey, Sebastian Weber, Northwest Central Strategic Planning Team. Really happy to get to see one of these live.
Great. And Eric.
Yeah, Eric Wood, Gas Supply Cascade.
Sure. And did anyone join while we were going through introductions? Yeah, I don't see any new names, so I think we're good to move on. I see there's something in the chat. Okay. So we'll move on to the safety moment. We're coming up to the end of the tag process, and putting together the narrative, it can be pretty stressful. I know as a also as a baseball fan this last week, it was very stressful. So here's some ways to relieve some stress. Listen to music. Playing calm, meditative, relaxing music can help lower blood pressure. This can include listening to ocean waves or nature sounds. Talk to someone, take a break, talk to a friend, talk to a counselor. When you are under a lot of stress, or a reassuring voice can help put everything into a better perspective. Healthy eating. Try to avoid sugary and fatty snack foods. Eating fruits, veggies, fish with high omega-3 fatty acids are a better alternative and have been shown to reduce stress symptoms. Laughter. They say is the best medicine when it comes to stress. It's true. Laughing releases endorphins that decrease the levels of stress hormones. Yeah. Dark chocolate. Yep. Drink tea. Avoid coffee and caffeinated drinks if possible. These beverages cause a short-term spike in blood pressure. Green tea has less caffeine and contains amino acids that have a calming effect. Exercise can help, even for a short walk. Take a break every 2 hours or something from work. Go on a quick 10-minute walk. That gets the blood moving, and it releases endorphins to immediately provide some relief. And then make sure you breathe. Take deliberate, slow, deep breaths to help center your body and clear your mind and slow your heart rate. Understand stress and how it affects your body can help you understand the right steps you need to take to help relieve it. And something I also like to do is find a hobby that I enjoy, like golf, even though that can be stressful at times, especially if you golf like me. So there's some things out there. Take care of your health, take care of your mental health, and make sure you not relieving that stress whenever you're feeling stressed. So stakeholder engagement. So I kind of want to just we've touched on the stakeholder engagement, every tag meeting. For those that are not familiar with it, go out to our website. It's linked at the bottom. We can familiarize. I know there's a couple people here that are new to this IRP process. It's their first tag meeting. Feel free to go out there, check out the stakeholder engagement. I kind of want to touch on the goals of the stakeholder engagement for this final tag meeting. While Cascade owns and is responsible for the IRP, the company desires to have involvement from stakeholders to provide a diversity of perspectives. A best practices IRP is informed by perspectives, analysis, and access to concerns and approaches that the company may not have considered. And some stakeholders, internal and external stakeholders, participate in multiple IRP processes. And you may have a line of sight that may not be available to Cascade. We attend multiple LDC's tag processes, but there's some conversations that we may miss that are before or after tag meetings, that if there's information there that you think Cascade can benefit from it, we would gladly take that information. So feel free to reach out with anything that you feel can improve the IRP and let us know. And since there are some new people to this IRP process in this tag meeting, for those people, please feel free to interrupt us at any point during the IRP and ask questions. You don't have to wait till the end. You can stop us between tag slides, and you could also type in chat if you have a question, and we'll be monitoring chat. All right, are there any questions about the process, the meeting itself, before we get going? All right, I'll kick it over to Ashton.
Great, thanks, Brian. Go ahead and go to the next slide. I'll just let you know. So backcasting, technically, I guess it would be called cross-validation. This is kind of what we do after we run the demand forecast, which would be in tag 2. So cross-validation estimates the skill of a model on unseen data. It'll flag problems like overfitting or sampling bias. We do the holdout cross-validation method where you split data into a training and a test set. And so the training set is like the historical data that the model is developed on. And then the test set is data that the model hasn't seen, and you compare it. And this helps us just determine how well our assumptions were for the development of the model. You can go to the next slide. So here I have a quick, you don't necessarily have to look at the graph, but I just wanted to show what the training and test set are for the upcoming graphs and the upcoming slides. So there at the bottom, you will see we have a training set, which is from 2015 all the way up to 2022, and it's January 2022. So that's what we developed the model on for each of these upcoming models. And then for the test set, that's going to be all the way up to August of 2022, so 2 months ago. And we're going to be comparing that forecast with the test set. And then if you look at the top, I also have some other terms up there: in sample forecasts and out of sample forecasts. So you've probably heard these before, but in sample forecast is that whole section because I took the model using that training set, and then I actually start forecasting from 2015. So from 2015 up out to the end of 2021, it should line up pretty well because that was the data that was used in developing the model. So you would expect that to line up really well. If that doesn't line up really well, you've got other problems you need to look at. When we're looking at the out of sample forecast, which is how we're testing the accuracy of the model, that's really where the gold lies. That's really where the answers lie for what we're looking at here. So we'll get into some of those results in the next slide. All right, so here we have Sumas Loop, which is the residential. 503 is residential. Last cross-validation is on top, and then the current one I did this month is on the bottom. So if you remember back in tag 2, I was presenting demand forecast, and we showed that we were talking about a new methodological change that we did, which was we took the customer, some of that ThoughtSpot data, which is the billing data, and we dove into it because if you look at the cross-validation on top, the forecast has consistently lagged behind the actual flow of gas. And so what that let us know is that we needed to dive into the billing data. And back in tag 2, we explained how we took some of the billing cycles that might end in a certain day in a month, but a majority of the billing cycle is actually in the previous month. So we created this this Excel file that would actually shift certain billing cycles back a month. And if you look at the cross-validation there at the bottom, it lines up so much better. So that was a really effective change that we did this year. And then looking into the, on that vertical line to the right of that would be the out of sample forecast. And you can see it's lining up really, really well. There's still a little bit of variance, but hey, nobody's forecast is perfect, but I'm super proud of this. If we jump into the next slide, it's very similar. Residential, commercial, quite similar. Commercial, again, if you look at the top, we were struggling to capture some of those valleys. There's some weird peaks in our forecast, and then also we were consistently lagged behind the data. And without doing cross-validation, I wouldn't have known this. So this is super useful to do. And there at the bottom, you see the new results, capturing the data a lot better with the new models. And then the forecast, the out of sample comparison lines up really, really well as well. And so if we go to the next slide, you'll see industrial, and this is where it gets a little trickier. Again, Sumas is one of our, how do I say it, more volatile city gates. It's one of the harder ones to forecast just because there's a lot of data and it's not super consistent. Like especially the industrial, as you can see, it's just been growing. It's kind of sporadic. It's got some weird peaks from year to year that aren't consistent. So you look at our cross validation last year, and it's just all over the place. It's struggling to stay on track. It's lagged behind. And you look this year after we did those model improvements, and we're lining up a lot better. There's still room for improvement. And industrial's tricky. They don't follow weather usage. You know, that doesn't affect them as much. Population and employment data doesn't affect them as much. It's a lot more time series based, and the Fourier terms that capture seasonality, those help a lot. But again, we're still trying to improve on the industrial side. You can see in the forecast portion, there's a peak there in the actual ThoughtSpot billing data that our forecast just didn't know was coming, or maybe it did and it underpredicted it. I'm not sure. So that kind of opens my eyes to, hey, you might want to look into the industrial side of things and see if you can't, find more regressors to get a little bit better accuracy there. If you go to the next slide,
Hey, Ashton, you have a question in chat. Is this representative of industrial customers generally?
Yes and no. I would say yes in the aspect that it's harder to forecast, but as you'll see when we jump into the Yakima side, Yakima industrial is actually a lot more predictable. So I would say in general, yes, but there are certain ones, like I threw in Yakima in here because for that exact reason, their industrial customers are super easy to predict. So I would say in general, yes, but there are some outliers. So if you go in the next slide, I'll show some. So Yakima is a lot easier, I would say, to forecast. The historical data is just super consistent with not a lot of variability. So I wanted to kind of show the dynamic between one of the easier city gates and then one of the harder city gates to forecast, because cross-validation takes me quite a while. And so I can't just cross-validate every single one of our city gates. It's just too time intensive. You'll see in a few slides, one of my goals would be to write a script in R to do this a lot faster. I haven't gotten there yet. So this is residential for Yakima. And as you can see, same thing. Last cross-validation, we were lagged behind. Again, I wouldn't have known this at all. Our forecasts were generally pretty good. When you dive into the nitty-gritty and do this cross-validation, you actually can uncover some of these things that you just didn't know were going on. So the cross-validation currently, the model lines up very, very good. It's capturing those valleys perfectly. The peaks, it's a little off, but that's mostly just due to weather changes. And then the forecast, it's lining up really well. As you can see, there's a slight bump there in usage in the billing data that a forecast didn't capture, but that could just be, a weather thing. Forecasts are on normalized weather, and this is actual, so it could fluctuate just a bit. Same thing if we go to the next slide for commercial, very predictable. As you can see, consistently lagged behind in the last cross-validation. In this one, we line up really, really well. And then, of course, in the out-of-sample forecast, we're lining up really, really well again. So pretty similar results for those. If you go into the industrial side, Byron, you'll see it's a lot easier to forecast on the Yakima side. You can see it's capturing the peaks and the valleys really, really well. There's not a lot of variability. There's a couple strange double peaks in there that my forecast is not capturing looks like every few years. So that's something I want to look into. The out of sample portions lining up really, really well. So I'm happy with these results. And when you zoom out, I guess I could have included that in this presentation. If we were to zoom out into the entire Yakima City Gate, rather than diving into each individual rate class and graph that, because you zoom out so much, a lot of these errors that we're seeing are so small, it just lines up beautifully. But I figure if we dive into the individual rate classes and really show those errors, that'd be a little bit more useful. But maybe next time I'll throw in kind of a zoomed out view of the entire city gate and compared with the out of sample forecast. Yeah, I guess next slide is just kind of my next steps, and then I'll pause for questions. I know I've been going kind of fast, but my next steps would be really focus on those industrial forecasts. I'd really like to figure out how we can improve those. I know that's kind of a pipe dream for a lot of forecasters because industrial customers are sometimes just all over the place. It's kind of hard to predict, but I'd really like to improve those. And then my second step, which would be to build a script so I can do these a little bit faster. It usually takes me a couple weeks to do each one, and that's just because I'm manually, scripting everything. And if I could somehow automate that a little bit better, that would really make my life easier, and we'd be able to cross-validate all kinds of city gates rather than just kind of picking a few. So that would be my next goals. Are there any questions on the cross-validation so far? All right, Brian, you can go to the next slide. If you think of a question, absolutely just throw it in chat and we can answer it. I just wanted to quickly go over some summary of alternative resources. Now we've already been over these in a previous tag, but we're just going to quickly summarize this. These are all the different things we throw at Plexos when it's developing a scenario. What can it choose from, essentially? So when we say incremental transport, we're essentially saying on top of what we currently have, what more transport could Plexos choose? So this could be that big red line, which is the northwest pipe, and it's bilateral. That could be incremental GTN, which is kind of that teal line that goes from Kingsgate down to Malin. That could be north to south or south to north. And then other incremental transports like that Pacific Connector or T-South, kind of these tiny little transports throughout our system. But the main ones would be kind of that Northwest Pipe and GTN. We'll go to the next slide here. You'll see incremental storage. So this is just, we say, hey, there's more storage available. Take it if you need it. That's kind of what we say to Plexos. And then it lets us know what was cost effective and what wasn't. So incremental storage could be in the Northeast. It could be more mist. We even throw in storages from California, like Wild Goose and Gill Ranch, because we don't want to introduce our bias saying, oh no, there's no way that would be cost effective. That's too far away. We don't want to introduce our bias, so we even throw in some storages that even we think might be a little ridiculous, but we don't want to cross anything out. So we let Plexos decide with all the pricing information, all the capacities, and we just kind of say, hey, you decide. If you go to the next slide, we're going to summarize just kind of everything else that might be incremental. So this could be incremental supplies around a basin like the Rockies. This could be RNG that would be directly injected or distributed into our system. This could be hydrogen that would be directly supplied to the system. We're just kind of throwing amounts into Plexos, and then it's kind of deciding what looks the best from the cost and from the supply perspective. I'm real quick, I'm reading a question in chat here. Could the expansion of CI interruptible programs intended for peak load reductions also improve the utility's ability to forecast and predict load?
Hey, Corey, what do you mean by CI programs?
I mean commercial industrial. So just kind of going back to Ashton's last, one of the last points about the trickiness of forecasting for commercial and industrial customers.
I would say I'm not super familiar with some of those interruptible programs, but I would say anything that creates consistency on the peak loads anything at all would definitely improve my ability to forecast the load. A lot of the difficulty in the forecasting comes from the variability in all those peaks and those double peaks. It's just, you'll have 5 years where there's just a single peak in an industrial customer. And then the 6th and the 7th year, it's got these strange double peaks. And it's just nowhere in the historical data did that occur. So I guess my answer, unless someone else wants to add on to that, would be if that type of program that intends to do peak load reduction, if that creates consistency, then absolutely.
I'll weigh in on that a little bit, just kind of a thought that I have on that. Depending on how those interruptible programs would operate, it may or may not have as much of an impact as we would like. Like, for instance, I would imagine that most interruptible programs are weather related. In cold potential conditions, we would have the opportunity to interrupt if that's the kind of program that you're envisioning in this. And I would argue that may not have a super significant impact on predictability because, and Ashton kind of talked about, he's talked about this in Tag 2 a lot, but when you're dealing with some of the, especially the larger industrial customers, you're seeing a lot less weather dependency and more operational peaks. So they'll just have seasonalities where they'll be cranking up their usage because it's, peak hop season or whatever, just throwing a random thing out there. That would not be an interruptibility program would not necessarily help with that predictive nature because they don't really care about the weather as much as just when is going to be their peak hop season. So I would temper expectations that it could be a little bit of a challenge if those interruptible programs would be weather dependent, just because that's not really how a lot of, especially those larger industrials, operate.
Okay, that makes sense. I asked that question just out of pure curiosity with knowledge that I don't obviously have expert knowledge of the nexus between those two things, but that all makes sense to me.
No, I think it was a fantastic question, though. I think that's an important part of this tag process is we're all trying to learn here and learn from each other and teach each other. The concept of increasing interruptible commercial and industrial interruptible programs is knowledge for us. So I think it was a very good question. I appreciated it.
Yeah, and I'm just making an educated assumption that these types of programs will probably be more common as the state there's goals toward reducing emissions. So that that just came to mind.
I think Byron, did you have a hand up?
Yeah, I have a question about the implications of considering renewable gas or hydrogen as incremental. Am I reading this right, that you consider all renewable natural gas and all hydrogen as incremental? Or is it that these are also incremental supplies that are available to your portfolio?
If I understand that, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, so right now, incremental, when we reference incremental, it means above and beyond what we currently have. And so you'll see throughout this presentation, there is a big need for hitting carbon compliance for incremental RNG and hydrogen.
So I guess the follow-up question is when I hear incremental, I imagine it being like a emergency spigot that's being turned on when the system needs that kind of incremental energy on the system to meet demand. Are there contracting problems that might arise from treating these sort of smaller fuels in that way? Because I imagine, and again, I don't have the industry experience, but I imagine that RNG contracts or hydrogen contracts would be more wouldn't they want a firmer contract or more consistent delivery than just being kind of turned on when the system needs it at the margins?
I think we might have a verbiage disconnect here. Because I think from our perspective, incremental is not what you're talking about. Would almost be when we refer to peaking resources. So for instance, I think it was Tag 3 or maybe tech too, we talked about our supply stack, and we have a peaking resource that kind of functions more in that, although not necessarily so much from an environmental perspective, but more from a extremely cold, we have an agreement with our marketer that they provide us X number of decatherms if we're in one of those extreme incremental situations. That's what we would really call a peaking resource. When we say incremental, what we're referring to is just anything above and beyond what's currently on our system. And while we're very close to, I mean, we have the Bandit project, which is public, and we're very close on a couple of other things in terms of getting some RNG on our system. Incremental is just, from our verbiage perspective, above and beyond what's currently happening in Cascade's operations.
Okay, I appreciate that clarification. That makes a lot more sense.
Awesome.
Is there any, are you guys considering the possibility that these fuels might, I guess, instead of being an increment of what you guys are currently using, be a replacement of what you are currently using?
Absolutely. And I think maybe that's a great clarifying point that we can put in our, when we describe this, when we, for instance, in the IRP, when we do definitions, because any decatherms that we would get of RNG would almost certainly replace, you know, it's not like these are going to serve new load. So they would almost certainly replace traditional natural gas. So yeah, and that might just be a verbiage mistake on our part in terms of not clarifying that further. But yeah, any incremental renewable natural gas would absolutely supplement any traditional natural gas.
Awesome. I appreciate that clarification. That really helped.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, and hopefully as we go through the remainder of this presentation, that should become more clear on how RNG and hydrogen kind of play with traditional supply.
Yep. All right, we can jump over to the next slide, Brian. I think that was my last slide, so I'll pass it off.
All right, so I'm going to go over the IRP modeling process for the resource integration and the components of candidate portfolios. So here's our supply resource optimization process flowchart. If people want to stay on this slide, you can, just to see how it flows. I'm going to move on to the next slide because it's essentially the same information, just in a step-by-step process. So here we have the step one. This is the as-is analysis, where we run a deterministic optimization of existing resources. So this is everything that we currently have on our system. So current transportation contracts, current storage contracts, our current demand forecast. This is, I think we do it before we even plug in DSM, just to see the as-is. Then we identify portfolios. So we evaluated 6 different portfolios of incremental resources for the 2023 IRP. Each will be a mix of various incremental resources, including transportation, RNG, hydrogen, and DSM. Analysis of these portfolios. So each portfolio will be run through the Plexos optimizer under expected conditions. The portfolios will be evaluated under deterministic and stochastic weather pricing, and the timing, quantity, if applicable, of unserved demand and emissions reduction shortfalls are recorded. And then a risk adjusted total system cost is provided for each portfolio. Ranking of portfolios. So then we look at these portfolios. Do they have any unserved? If there's unserved, if we're not hitting emission targets, or if we're not serving our customers, those automatically get put to the bottom of our ranking. We want to make sure that we are serving our customers, that we're reliable to serve them, that we're hitting emission targets, and then we'll look at costs, and we try and minimize the cost as best as we can. So that's the ranking of portfolios. So once we rank, we'll look at it and we'll take that top ranked portfolio, and we will run it through multiple different scenario analysis. This is step 5. So we take that top ranked portfolio, rerun it through Plexos under 5 different scenarios, and we chose 5 different scenarios. That way we can do a deep dive into those. Before, we would run multiple portfolios and multiple different scenarios, and we would just provide generic information on all those portfolios. But we want to take a deeper dive into these 5 scenarios and look at them in great detail. These scenarios will provide sensitivity testing of customer growth, energy efficiency, RNG, hydrogen, natural gas bans, natural gas pricing. It's evaluated under deterministic and stochastic weather pricing and the timing quantity, if applicable, of unserved demand and emissions reductions. Cascade will also record the risk-adjusted total system cost of each portfolio. And then we perform a qualitative and quantitative review of the top rank portfolio. Does it hit emission targets? What does the cost look like? If there are any concerns about the portfolio's ability to hit these metrics or the cost of hitting these metrics, the company may loop back to step 5 and go back, look at the next ranked portfolio, run that through scenario analysis, and continue on until we're satisfied with the preferred portfolio. And I see, Byron, you have a question?
Yeah, I guess my question is, when you guys come up with the new portfolio, does it go through all of the same rigmarole of steps, I guess, 2 and 3, or is it just going back through 5? And like, how much leeway is there in the choice of this new portfolio? Because I guess it sounds like you could just go through all the way to step 6 and then just make up a preferred portfolio at that point. So like, it seems like I'm kind of missing something there. Like, why not just do that from the get-go?
So why not go through all 6 steps? Is that what you're asking?
Well, I guess
For
like it's
each
kind
portfolio?
of twofold. Like, on the one hand, if you could just make a new portfolio to kind of like tinker with it and get what you want, why not do that from the get-go and like have these new portfolios just from the get-go and not go through all the rigmarole? Or conversely, why does the new portfolio not go through all of the rigmarole that the other ones did?
I can kind of try to explain that if you want, Brian.
Yeah, go ahead.
So a lot of the reason for the portfolio steps is based on the UTC rule, actually, where we're required to evaluate a number of portfolios. And that's really a holdover from the electric world, where you're supposed to really evaluate, for instance, you know, a hydro portfolio versus a solar portfolio versus a coal portfolio back in the day versus a wind versus, say, a mix of some of those resources. In our world, you know, it used to be a lot more restricted, where just traditional natural gas was our only solution. So in past IRPs, the portfolios would be, you know, we would kind of brainstorm what we want our portfolios to look like, right? And some of them would be, keep in mind, this is a pre-environmental compliance world. We would be looking at things like, do we want Northwest Pipe only expansion solutions, or GTN only expansion solutions, or DSM only solutions, or an optimized mix of all of those? That would be the portfolio mix that we would end up coming with. So we would come up with X number of portfolios, usually around 5 or 6 portfolios. And then for time efficiency standards, we would evaluate them all under expected conditions first. So that's still deterministic and stochastic, but expected in the sense that we're not tweaking any of the sensitivity variables in that step 5 yet. We're doing, what do we expect our availability of certain resources to be? What do we expect our price of certain resources to be, in terms of not doing any, like, for instance, we have the interruption scenario or the electrification scenario, not looking at it under those scenarios, just looking at it under expected, but also still some stochastic, which is almost a misnomer, but essentially expected deterministic and expected stochastic, which almost sounds paradoxical, but expected conditions, essentially, right? And so to save time, so we're not having to run all these portfolios through all these scenarios, we really want to try to identify under those expected conditions, because that arguably is the most important thing, right? You know, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out what we expect to happen. What portfolio does best under those expected conditions? So as Brian will talk about, we have I think it's like 5 or 6 different portfolios that are different mixes of things like RNG, hydrogen, DSM, non-renewable solutions, and then an optimized mix of all of those. You expect the optimized mix to be the most successful because obviously it's been run through an optimizer. So we expect that to be the number one portfolio, at least in the pre-scenario testing world. So kind of we expect that to be number one, but we still go through the process to make sure that maybe under stochastic conditions, maybe under extreme weather or extreme price, for instance, the optimized mix may be missing something that one of the other portfolios doesn't mix. So we kind of run it through this process just to make sure, but we do presume that, you know, we expect to some extent that that optimized portfolio will end up as number one. So then once we've identified that as the top ranking candidate portfolio, then it goes through that scenario analysis. So then if you have a list of 5 or 6, the top one is taken off and thrown through the rigmarole, to use your term. So then we go through the electrification scenario with it. We go through the interrupted supply scenario with it. And as kind of we'll talk about, or I'll talk about later, we do really an in-depth analysis of how does it perform and what can we glean from that information. So what can we glean from the fact that, you know, in an electrification scenario, we're able to hit our goals, for instance, but that may be a misnomer because, you know, it looks great from a price perspective to us, but somebody else might get those costs shifted. Just one example, right? We do that kind of in-depth qualitative and quantitative analysis for all of those scenarios. And then we kind of look at it holistically, right? We kind of say, okay, do we feel comfortable that we're able to hit our demand, to hit our emissions targets? Are the total system costs within a tolerable range for that portfolio under all of those scenarios? If something looks like it would be really, for lack of a better term, world breaking for us, if that portfolio, let's say, were to not be able to even come close to hitting emissions targets, and it's from something that could very reasonably happen, that could be a situation where it would be disqualified, and we would go to the next ranking portfolio and go once again through this scenario analysis. And if all of them were to fail, we'd have to frankly go back to the drawing table and start brainstorming what do we need to do differently with these portfolios. So that's a lot. I hope that kind of explains the process a little bit. And if you want me to clarify something else, definitely let me know. Awesome.
Is there any other questions before I move on? Okay, so I'll be jumping into the portfolios, but before that, we'll do a recap of the as-is analysis. So we had finalized our load forecast earlier in the IRP process. All of Cascade's existing resources have been run through Plexos to complete the company's as-is analysis as discussed in step 1 of the supply resource optimization process. We assume that transportation contracts, storage contracts, all that evergreens, because if we had them expiring, we would see a lot more shortfalls. Assuming emissions reduction requirements as outlined in the CCA and CPP, but no usage of compliance instruments. And then these preliminary results do not include the impacts of incremental DSM beyond existing installed measures that are already captured with the load forecast model. So here on the transport side, we have a shortfall in zone 11. And as you can see in our map, zone 11 is here in this Yakima area above the Zilla compressor station, all the way up into Wenatchee. And then zone Meade, Washington, and GTN is 2038. So this purple line here, this is GTN. There is a gate off of GTN that serves an area here in Washington, but it also goes down into Central Oregon. And so we have contracts that can drop off gas at this area or this area. So we kind of combined it. We would have, if we need to pick up more transportation, we could do it by adding more transportation here, which would allow these current GTN contracts to go down further. So it gives us different options. On the emission side, if we didn't have any compliance instruments, we'd see shortfalls in the first year of the Climate Protection Plan in Oregon and the Climate Commitment Act in Washington. So without, under the as is, if we didn't look at any compliance measures, we would definitely have some shortfalls. So compliance instruments were definitely the forefront of solving our emission constraints in this IRP process. So here's a list of our candidate portfolios. We want to look at. Oh, yeah, JP, do you have a question?
Hey, Brian, I'm sorry. Can you go back to that slide real fast? Let's make sure I understand it correctly. Thank you so much. So in terms of actual gas availability in, I'm sorry to make this Oregon specific at a Washington meeting, but in Oregon, that's the zone ME-Washington and GTN. You guys have enough transport capacity until 2038, and that's when your first shortfall would be, given everything you have planned in the IRP, right?
If we had our as is, so if we didn't pick up any energy efficiency,
okay,
we would see it in 2038.
Okay, got it.
I think the last IRP we showed that under our avoided cost methodology, we were able to determine a certain amount of energy efficiency with ETO, and that would delay the shortfall about 11 years, I think it was.
Okay. And that, so, all right, so 2038, no, that's with no additional energy efficiency. That's just
correct. Yeah.
And then in terms of emissions, you're talking about this, if the CCIs weren't available, you would have emissions constraints appearing right away.
Yeah, I think when we say compliance instruments, we're also talking about RNG and hydrogen.
Okay. Yeah, great. So the full suite of things you guys are planning on.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Exactly.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Sorry to interrupt. Appreciate it.
No problem. Yeah. So a list of candidate portfolios, I'm just gonna read them off. We'll go into each one in depth. We have the all-in portfolio. We have the all-in portfolio without DSM. We like to run this one just to show the impact that DSM has on our modeling. Transportation only portfolio. So this is where we look just at transportation, offsets only, RNG only, hydrogen only, and then in a renewables only portfolio where we combine RNG and hydrogen. So the all-in portfolio, this is the best deterministic mix of all our alternative resources considered. We're looking at incremental transport resources, incremental storage resources, cost-effective DSM from the CPA, incremental RNG, incremental hydrogen, and compliance instruments. And when we say incremental RNG and incremental hydrogen, this is from the it includes our projections of what we're seeing for on system, but also the AGF ICF study. I always get those acronyms wrong. But those projections, and then compliance instruments as well. So the all-in portfolio suggested resource mix. So the all cost-effective DSM, and this is for the Climate Commitment Act modeling. We would be looking at incremental RNG utilized mostly in Oregon, 154,210 decatherms starting in 2023, up to 15 million decatherms by 2050. So just a little bit of a difference, if you recall from tag 4, the Climate Protection Program allows for off-system RNG, so that's where most of this RNG is coming from. Whereas Washington, as the current rule states, we would not be allowed to do the off-system RNG. So that's why you don't see much or any RNG in Washington. And one thing we have to remember with our IRP modeling is we have to look at the total system, not just one state and the other state. We're looking at the least cost way to meet the entire system. And so even though our on-system RNG, we're looking at it in both Washington and Oregon, it may be used only in Washington, it may be only used in Oregon. Incremental hydrogen, we're looking at 90,970 decatherms starting in 2029, up to about 500,000 decatherms by 2050. And then compliance instruments, those are utilized as needed. Exact numbers are under confidential treatment because the allowances go under an auction process. We're going to keep the exact number of auction allowances that we would need out and keep that confidential. Are there any questions? And just to take a look at the graph, this blue line, this is demand before we include any DSM. So when you include DSM, you can see that the demand becomes more flatter. It is decremented about, looking at 250,000 metric tons, it looks like. So it does decrement the emissions quite a bit. This gray, this is the no cost allowances. This is what we're given. Those do have to be put into the auction and then we can purchase them back. The blue is the offsets. Yellow are the auctions, and then the green is the hydrogen. And I see, Byron, you have a question?
Yes. Does the, I guess, like minimum requirements, it sounds, for your portfolio is that you want it to meet the emissions goals and you want it to meet demand. For the, it seems like there's very little RNG in there. And I guess, is it one of your criteria that you also have to meet your voluntary RNG goals? So my understanding is that there's supposed to be a voluntary program for consumers to purchase renewable gas from their utilities. Is that a constraint within your portfolio selection?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, and I'll have to take a deeper dive. I know that the RNG is, because we're not allowed to purchase off system, and maybe someone can correct me if I'm wrong on whether we can do off system RNG with the voluntary RNG program. But I think the RNG is a sliver, and it may actually be in here. I'll have to go back and look at the actual number, the actual data for this graph. But that's a good point, and we'll definitely want to make sure to look at that and make sure we're capturing the voluntary RNG program.
So yeah, I'll also kind of weigh in a little bit also, because so this graph, and it basically Brian nailed it, but just kind of to clarify, this graph is specifically related to modeling for the Climate Commitment Act, and a major portion of the Climate Commitment Act is, as of this point, although I know it's still being discussed, but we can only go off assumptions as to what we know at this point, that book and claim philosophy will not be a part of the Climate Commitment Act. So we have to operate under that assumption. So anything related to the voluntary program, kind of, that's a process that I think will be handled exogenously from the IRP. So we're more focused on the IRP on compliance with the Climate Commitment Act and climate protection programs, along with meeting our transportation goals in a least cost, or by transportation goals, I mean serving our customers in a least cost manner.
Here's the total system cost. So we're able to pull the total system cost for the entire 28-year horizon by year. So you can see the baseline total system cost. These are traditional costs, so traditional transportation traditional storage, traditional supply, and then anything to meet the emissions, so RNG costs, hydrogen costs, compliance instruments. Those are captured in this green piece right here. And so you can see that the total system cost is starts around $250 million, rising up to about $800 million. Yeah, that's a great question, Byron, and we plan to have impacts to customer rates provided in the IRP narrative. We don't have those quite yet, but we will be providing those.
Yeah, I was really surprised when I saw that graph because I spent the time like yesterday to look through everything. That's a really big increase, and it's like I was wondering, like, given like the elasticities of like people's demand with prices and stuff, do you guys intend to turn around and remodel or have that feed back into demand? Because
So
that's a huge increase.
Yeah, so you bring up an excellent point. We've been having discussions about that. We've consulted with Guidehouse to help us with compliance modeling, and demand. We don't know exactly what is going to happen with demand when these costs are actually realized. So we need to do more studies on other areas that have seen big cost increases to customer rates and the impacts demand has seen from those customer rates. So we're definitely going to be looking at that in terms of price elasticity with customers.
So I'll also weigh in a little bit on that. I think, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this in the electrification scenario that we have, but there are a lot of challenges with price elasticity because one thing to keep in mind is that the gas world is not in a vacuum when it comes to these compliance goals. So, two options that I can think of off the top of my head, because elasticity is all about choice, right? So two options that I could think of that customers would have otherwise. I mean, I guess some could theoretically choose to go and just have their houses, for instance, be colder or not use as much. I guess there might be something to that. I don't know if that would have a major change to load, but DSM is obviously one major one, is people having the option of choice and then choosing more efficient furnaces or DSM measures. That I believe is already captured in the fact that we include environmental compliance costs in the energy efficiency calculation. So I think we might already be capturing that. And then just straight up switches, there's challenges with that I think as an industry we're going to have to do a more holistic analysis of before we can definitively say what might happen on that front. Because, once again, if customers are choosing to make a shift, for instance, what will the cost look like for those who now would be taking on those new customers? That is something that I think as an industry or as an entire region, frankly, is still yet to be figured out. Because if it's going to be just as significant of an increase for those folks as well, if not more expensive for them to start adding on new customers, ultimately it might be a question of, what is that alternative that elasticity would evaluate besides just using less, which in and of itself could be a challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Great question, and thanks, Devin. So we'll move on to DSM, all-in less DSM portfolio. So everything is exactly the same in terms of transport, storage, RNG, hydrogen, compliance instruments. We just took out the DSM, the expected future DSM, all the historical DSM still in the load forecast, just to see what that portfolio would look like. And you could see here that RNG, the need for RNG is increased about, if I recall correctly, about 15 million. By 2050, now it's 17 million. And then 90,000 for hydrogen, up to 524,000. And then compliance instruments, again, don't have those exact numbers to provide, but those will be provided under confidential treatment. And so you could see that the demand line and the demand less DSM line are the exact same. We'll look at the total system cost. You can see that including DSM saves us about $100 million over the 28 years, or by 2050. So you can see that the impact DSM has, it's a very great resource for us, and it really does bring down the cost for customers. Are there any questions on portfolio 2? Okay. So now we're going to look at just the transportation only. So this is, we do include the cost-effective DSM, but the only resource we use is transportation. Just looking at incremental transportation, you can see here, there's some issues with this one. We do have DSM that brings demand down, but we don't have any compliance to meet emissions. If we're just looking at transport and not purchasing RNG and hydrogen, we will not be hitting compliance targets. But you can see the total system cost. We do not consider these as candidate portfolios to move on to step 5 and step 6, just because we're missing hitting emission targets. Offsets only. So this is an interesting one. Cost-effective demand side management from the CPA, and then best deterministic mix of auction allowances and offsets in Washington, and community climate investments in Oregon. So you can see here in Washington, we're actually able to meet our demand with just compliance instruments. However, in Oregon, we are not able to meet the climate protection plan with just offsets. So this one's not considered a candidate portfolio, mainly because we need to be able to hit emissions in both states. And total system cost, we have shortfalls in Oregon, so we're missing some costs there. So the total system cost is a bit lower than the all-in, but that's because we're not meeting compliance.
So one thing I want to kind of weigh in on here also is, because we had this discussion as a team, quite an extensive discussion actually, about should we try in these graphs to quantify the cost of non-compliance, right? Because, you know, while just looking at these graphs without no reference for portfolio 3 and 4, the costs look pretty great. However, the major element that Brian alluded to is the cost for compliance is missing, or then frankly, the reverse of it, the cost of non-compliance, right? Ultimately, that's not an option we even want to be considering at this point. We're going to comply with whatever laws are presented to us. You know, penalties, while extremely significant, it would blow these figures out, put us into the trillions of trillions, and just blow these graphs out of the water. It's not something we even want to consider, frankly. So that's why, you know, just as a point of clarification, these costs may look low on some of these that are not considered, but it doesn't include any kind of penalty cost that we would potentially be subjected to, because that's not even an alternative that we're willing to consider. And I see, Byron, you have a question.
Yeah, could you go back one slide? I was wondering if you could kind of explain the dynamic between purchasing offsets versus auctions. Like, at what point, like, does the on switch get turned for purchasing offsets versus the choice of auctions? Like, what's like the tipping point that makes offsets viable in those certain little blips and not viable in the other ones?
Yeah, I think that's all due to availability. If I recall correctly, it's availability and cost. I think in the earlier years, offsets are priced at about 50% of what the allowances are. So it's going to purchase the offsets as much as it can. But the offsets are limited. And then you'll have to look at these by compliance period. So compliance period 2024 through 2027 for Washington. So you can see that it's buying as much as it can. And the earlier it is, the cheaper it is. And then in 2028, since we have a compliance period 2028 through 2031, it's going to buy as much offsets it can in this first year when it's cheapest. That's one thing about Plexos. It has perfect knowledge. You have to remember the perfect knowledge piece about Plexos is it knows that it's going to need as many offsets as possible in 2028. So it's going to purchase the maximum amount. So that's why you see these blips in 2028. That's a compliance period. A new compliance period starts in 2032. A new one in 2036. A new one in 2040. And then I'd have to look at this area on the availability plus as well as the pricing. But that's the main reason for these blips that you're seeing.
So in actual practice, we should expect it to be a bit more like staggered and leveled out.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on how these offsets are done. But I would expect them to be a little more staggered out and a little more levelized.
Yeah, I think in terms of strategy, I don't think any of us are confident as to what we're going to do strategically when evaluating offsets versus auctions, right? I mean, there's still meetings actively going on about how the auction mechanisms are going to even work. We have contracted with a consultant, Guidehouse, who is giving us some fantastic guidance about how do we handle these challenges. And I think ultimately they're going to help us come up with those strategy portions of it so that when we do have to make these decisions of when do we participate in auctions versus when do we invest in offsets, they should be able to help us look at the optimized decisions of it and come up with the strategy for that. But I think at this point, everything is way too new that it's only going to be useful to talk about it from a theoretical perspective. I think it's not reasonable to talk about it from a practical perspective because we're all still kind of fairly blind about this.
Yeah, and I'll go back to one of Mark's favorite quotes about the IRP. The IRP informs, but it does not decide. So it's going to inform our gas supply and environmental compliance teams. Hey, this is what our model says for offsets. This is what it's priced at. This is what auctions are priced at. This is what our model says. They can go out and say, well, we can't get that many offsets in 2028, but we could get that amount if we levelize it. And we'd say, okay, that works. We could also, if we find out more information that's how offsets work, we can go back into our model and kind of limit when they can purchase. We can levelize that out if we need to. But right now we allow it to buy the offsets when it's needed, just because that's our current understanding of how offsets and allowances will work. Okay, so moving on to RNG only. This cost-effective DSM from CPA with incremental RNG So you can see there. You can actually see the small sliver here in on this slide. There's a small sliver of blue. Maybe you can't see it, but it is there. So if we were, because of the current rule in Washington about book and claim, right now we're not considering off-system RNG in Washington. That could very well change. That would change this modeling quite a bit. And we do have shortfalls due to emissions. I don't remember if Oregon was able to handle it with RNG only. But we'll have that in our Tag 5 Oregon presentation. Again, total system costs, we don't consider as a candidate portfolio. We aren't calculating non-compliance right now. But these are the costs that we see. Hydrogen only portfolio, cost-effective DSM from the CPA, and then incremental hydrogen. So here, this would be if we just did hydrogen only. You could see, again, we're missing compliance in the Climate Commitment Act. You can see that the green hydrogen, it goes up and then it levelizes, and we discussed this in previous tag meetings. That's because we're only able to blend our system up to a certain percentage. We're currently using 20% based on some of the studies that we've seen. That obviously that number could change. It could go lower, it could go, I don't know if it would go higher, it could. But as of right now, we're using 20% blend. And again, total system costs for the hydrogen only case. Renewables only portfolio, cost effective DSM from CPA, and then RNG and hydrogen. Again, not considered as a candidate portfolio due to emission reduction shortfall. So we would not be able to hit emission targets if we looked at just RNG and just hydrogen currently for the Climate Commitment Act. Again, here are the emission costs and baseline total system costs for this portfolio. And then I believe in the next slide, we kind of we talk about the ranking of portfolio. So we use deterministic results to identify the intrinsic value of a portfolio and value at risk analysis to capture the extrinsic value. Additionally, portfolios are ranked primarily on their peak date unserved demand and secondarily on their total system costs. Deterministic results are given 75% weight, and stochastic results are 25% weight. I think we've used this the past 3 IRP processes. And this is in industry best practices that other LDCs have been using as well. And the concluding values are Cascade's risk-adjusted results. And so we'll go to the next slide and we'll look at a graph of all the total system costs, including emissions. So if you recall correctly, Portfolio 1 and Portfolio 2 are the only ones that were considered because they were the only ones that were able to meet emission compliance in both Washington and Oregon. And I think this is the cumulative total system cost for each year. So here we do a final ranking of the portfolios with deterministic emission reduction shortfalls will not be so any that say yes under emission reduction shortfalls, those are already kicked out. We look at the portfolios that are able to meet the emission compliance, and the number one portfolio is the all-in with DSM. So again, looking at the all-in with DSM, we're back to this graph where we have RNG starting at 154,000 decatherms in 2023, going up to about 15 million decatherms by 2050, and this is mostly utilized in Oregon, a very small sliver in Washington. Incremental hydrogen, 90,000 decatherms in 2029, up to 500,000 by 2050, and then again, compliance instruments. Okay. So I think what we're going to do is, before I jump into the stochastic methodology, I'm going to open it up for questions. If there are no questions, we'll take a 10-minute break. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. So let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 10:30. If you have any questions that come up, please feel free to post them in the chat, and we'll try to answer them as we filter back in. All right. See everyone in 10 minutes. All right, everyone, it is 10:30, so we'll continue on with the presentation. I think we're about halfway through, so we're looking good on time. So we're going to talk about stochastic model methodology for a bit. So prior to the 2018 IRP, just to give a little bit of a historical background, we used Monte Carlo functionality within Sendout to run stochastic analysis. There were some computational limits with Sendout with our stochastic methodology and the time it took to complete those draws. We had, in that 2018 IRP, we had enhanced our methodology to allow for more robust Monte Carlo simulations on weather and price. We pulled that process outside of Sendout, and we started running our own Monte Carlo simulations. So, and I'll dive into those a little further. In 2020, we had further enhanced the Monte Carlo simulations by making sure that our basins were correlated and that our weather was correlated between weather stations. For the 2023 IRP, we're keeping that same Monte Carlo simulation process where we are going to correlate the prices between basins and the weather correlation between the weather stations. And I'll jump into exactly our step-by-step process. So we continue to perform 10,000 draws. We're able to do that within R, the statistical analysis software, and that can run and Ashton can let me know how quickly we can do those, but we can run the 10,000 draws fairly quickly for both weather and price. So for each weather location, Cascade records daily mean temperatures, a standard deviation, correlations, and the largest one-day jump to have historically occurred. If we don't include that one-day jump, you would see days where there's a 30-degree jump between days. So we have to kind of correlate those day-to-day jumps a little bit. That way we don't get huge jumps from day to day. Similarly, for each basin, Cascade records historical averages, lows, highs, standard deviations, and correlations between basins. This data is all loaded into R, where R can perform 10,000 28-year unique weather patterns and price patterns. So first, Cascade runs one draw of its Monte Carlo simulation for its weather location. So the remaining weather locations are then run for draw one, but they're correlated to the first weather location using a mathematical process called Cholesky decomposition. This process helps create a more realistic simulation for each draw. This process is repeated 10,000 times, so that process up there that is done for one draw. It gives us a 28-year weather pattern that we can put into our demand forecast, and we can forecast 10,000. We can forecast a 28-year demand portfolio to put into Plexos, and then we can do this 10,000 times with the calculated HUDs from each draw stored in a separate matrix. And then a similar process is followed for price. We do one draw at a time, and then we can do 10,000 draws fairly quickly. So what does the weather correlation look like with and without the Cholesky decomposition matrix? So this right here, this is a historically correlated weather. You can see Baker City, obviously, if you correlate it with its own self, it's a perfect correlation. But if you look at like Bellingham and Baker City, they're pretty far apart. They're pretty different in terms of their weather portfolios, so they still have a 0.63 correlation. But as you go down like Baker City and Pendleton, Redmond, Walla Walla, they're a little more correlated. And then you can see Yakima. So we do this for each one. You can go through and look at Bremerton and Redmond and look at their correlations. Now, if we just run every draw and don't correlate the basins altogether or at all, you could see that there's no correlation from one draw to the next. Or so like if we look at draw one, if we look at Bremerton compared to let's say Bellingham and Bremerton, there would be hardly any correlation, even though those places are very close to each other. You would expect them to have very similar weather patterns. Historically, it's at about 86% correlated, 87%. And so when we include this Koleski adjustment to correlate them, you can see that, yeah, Bellingham, Bremerton, 87, 88%. So this really helps with making sure that our draws are correlated, and we want to correlate them because we want a very realistic weather pattern. We don't want to run a draw that has very cold weather in Bellingham and very warm weather in Bremerton. That just wouldn't make sense. We want to make sure that they are actually realistic weather patterns. So in the previous IRP, what we would do is we would take the 99th percentile draw and we would put it into our Sindow model. And we would just run that one draw and call that our stochastic run. Currently, we want to, in the current IRP, we want to run 200 draws inside of Plexos. So we want to plug in 200 different demand portfolios and run it in Plexos and say, hey, what we can dissect this in multiple ways. We can say, hey, what does the second compliance period look like in the Climate Commitment Act under these 200 different random draws? And we can build histograms of what our allowance auctions will look like and our offsets will look like. Do those vary? How far do those vary? So this being able to plug in 200 random draws into Plexos is very important. There are some limitations. So as of right now, our all-in case to run in Plexos takes about an hour. So if you look at trying to run 200 random draws, you're looking at 200 hours just to run it. If you run it and you're like, oh man, we made a mistake, there's another 200 hours. You got to go in and fix something. And so you can see that there's some time limits with that. We've been working with Energy Exemplar for some solutions. They were kind enough to run 200 draws for us in a very quick manner. So we have some for this tag meeting, but we are looking at some solutions to move forward. That way we're able to run 200 draws within a day or two. And so we'll be able to run a lot more Monte Carlos once that is implemented. So here's what it looks like. This is with, and you have to remember, this is with expected customer count. So under expected customer counts, we could see Washington demand varying about 1.5 million decatherms in a year. You also notice that there's a slight decline with demand, and that's due to, if you recall from tag 2, climate change impacts. We also have the climate change impacts incorporated into our Monte Carlo simulations. So these we can draw 151 and look at the different ways that it can meet compliance. So these are the 200 draws that we put into our Plexos model. And here's the first compliance period, demand. you can see that it varies from 104 million decatherms for that 4-year period between 2024 and 2027, up to about 107 million. And we can go into these draws and look at, so for this 107 million, we can go in and say, hey, look, what are the allowances looking like? What are the offsets looking like? Did it pick up more RNG in this case? We can look at these different draws and gain a better understanding of the the combination of planning for Oregon and Washington at the same time. So there's a lot of cool different things we can do with Monte Carlo simulations and the results. So looking at total system cost from these 200 draws, you can see that it varies. These are in thousands of dollars, and these are the entire 28-year. You can see it varies from about 12.6 billion to about 12.7 billion, so about 100 million in variance, just based on weather variance. Are there any questions on that? I know there was a lot of information there. I was going to put together a shortfall, but based on our current understanding of auction allowances in Washington right now, it appears that there should be enough allowances to purchase to meet all these different weather demand profiles. So I didn't put anything together because we weren't seeing any shortfalls in Washington. Okay. So I'll show some price simulation results. So on this left graph, you can see that this is all 10,000 simulations for ACO. You can see that there's a lot of different price patterns. Most of them are staying under $20. But there are some cases where who knows what may happen. There could be a shortage of traditional supply, and prices just shoot up. These ones that go above 40, 60, we have one above $100. Those are what we call black swan events. And this right graph, when we take a look at what falls under the 99th percentile, you can see that we actually don't exceed $25. So we do feel fairly confident that ACO will stay under $25. I mean, I would say over 80% of them stay under $10. But this gives us a great range of putting different price paths into Plexos and seeing what impacts there are on supply. We could plug in different price impacts, some of these higher ones, and see if more RNG is taken, and stuff like that. So here's Rockies again, left all 10,000. You can see it gets up to about $50. When we look at the 99th percentile, we're pretty confident that it'll stay under $20. And then we have Sumas. Again, Sumas, I think historically we've seen more volatility there. So when you're doing Monte Carlo results and you have that higher standard deviation, you're going to see a bigger outliers. So you can see we exceed $300 in one of these draws towards 2050. You never know what may happen, but in terms of the 99th percentile, we feel fairly confident that most of them will be under the $50 range. Are there any questions on the price? We'll have more, there will be a lot more results and narrative on this in the actual tag narrative, or sorry, not tag narrative, IRP narrative but we wanted to make sure everyone was aware of our simulation results and the different price patterns that we're putting into Plexos. I think with that, I will be kicking it over to Devin for scenario and sensitivity results.
All right, thanks, Brian. So yeah, we've already alluded to this to some extent, but at this point in the process, we've identified our top ranking candidate portfolio. And once again, unsurprisingly, it is that all-in with DSM portfolio. So now we want to run it through a little bit of a stress test, right? And we talked a little bit, I think we might talk even here some about what is a scenario versus what's a sensitivity for Cascade. Brian, if you want to go to the next slide. This is something that we've completely overhauled our process for. So in previous IRPs, what we did was more of a scattershot approach, for lack of a better term, where we would model a wide breadth of scenarios and sensitivities that, and after talking to some stakeholders, we got a little bit of feedback that might have been too much jack of all trades, master of none, for lack of a better term. We might have been trying to do too much and not enough detail or actionable results out of what we did. So the pro of that is it did allow us to expand a wide number of externalities. You know, we looked at what happens if prices go up 30%, 20%, 10%. What happens if we lose gas at ACO? What happens if we lose gas at Sumis, Rockies? All of these different things. But the time constraint of that, or the biggest con of that, is that it's a huge time constraint to do a deep analysis of those results. If we have 30 different scenarios, it's just not possible with the constraints that we have as a company to really do an in-depth analysis on what each of those mean. So what we've decided to do for this IRP is we reduce the number of scenarios that we've run to 5. But now for each of those scenarios, we're going to have a robust quantitative and qualitative analysis of what changes do we see and what do we actually think are the actionable results of those changes. And that's related to our ability to meet our emissions reduction requirements, related to total cost, ability to serve demand. Those 3 major things are the most important things that we look at, but any other interesting results we'll make sure to call out as well. An important kind of quick definitions moment, because this comes up quite a bit with all the different various LDCs. Scenarios and sensitivities are terms that are used in the UTC rules, which is why we do them, but we want to make sure that, you know, they're not fully defined, and everybody has their own definitions for these terms. So for the purpose of Cascade's IRP, when we say scenario, we're talking about a series of assumptions, and those assumptions are the sensitivities that are going to differ from our base case modeling. So when we talk about electrifications, this is a scenario. It's not we're saying that we think severe electrification is going to happen, but it's a scenario that we want to model, a what if. Now, the sensitivities, once again, are those variables within a given scenario. So that's going to be the price and or quantity of RNG, the amount of DSM that we think might be available, the amount of hydrogen that we think we could inject into our system. Things like that are going to be those sensitivities. And so in each scenario, I'm going to go into what are the sensitivities that are toggled to give us an idea of what exactly comprises the scenario. And then I'm also going to spend a little bit of time talking about what we discovered in this first round of scenario modeling for each of these scenarios. But once again, a much more in-depth analysis will be included in the IRP itself. So first, kind of a quick highlight of all the scenarios. So we have our base case, and that means customer growth is going to be what we expect it to be. Our energy efficiency inputs are going to be from our conservation potential assessments. Once again, that's in Washington, that's Monica and her team. And in Oregon, it's from the Energy Trust of Oregon. The RNG availability is going to be that expected availability. Once again, you'll remember from previous TAG meetings that comes from that, and as Brian said, that AGF ICF study. Hydrogen, we are assuming a 20% by volume, 7% by energy allowed blend. And that obviously is a very hotly debated subject. And as you'll see, we do kind of toggles on both lower availability and higher availability sensitivity analyses, but our base case is assuming that 20%. For natural gas bans, we include the current bans. So that's mostly Bellingham, and then in Bellingham for Washington, and kind of just discussions about what's going on in Bend, and that's a very dynamic process that we're kind of always staying on top of. But there are additional bans that are being in a more proposed stage, that in that electrification scenario, we kind of really juice that, for lack of a better term, or really kind of increase the number of bans as reflected by some of those other proposals. And then natural gas price comes off of our IRP price forecast, which is a 20-year or 28-year forecast that's run every week. But we kind of isolate one, I think it was in like mid-May, and say, okay, we're locking in, this is the price forecast. Unfortunately, prices have been quite volatile recently for those of us who pay attention to it. So it's a good thing that we do this kind of scenario and sensitivity analysis because of that volatility. Yeah. So we can go ahead to the next slide. So base case, we've pretty much been talking about this entire time. We don't need to belabor that point any further. So I'm going to go into the other scenarios that we run. So the first is this carbon neutral by 2050. This slide may be familiar from prior tags, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But the main element is that we have no emissions by 2050 as per CCA CPP guidelines. So once again, we are still allowed to use compliance instruments like auctions, offsets, and CCIs in Oregon to meet that 2050 carbon neutral for this particular scenario. Things that are toggled, we're going to use higher energy efficiency. We're going to probably need more RNG, so that's going to be higher, and it's going to be at a higher price for those higher amounts. We're going to allow the system, if it wants, to increase that blend of hydrogen as much as 30% by volume. Natural gas bans stay the same. Yeah, I will stop here. Kim, you have a question?
Thanks, Devin. I just want to clarify, because these I'm really grateful for these scenarios, and they're really familiar with, I think, some of what we were exploring in the natural gas fact finding here in Oregon. And I just wanted to, like, I think at least the way that carbon neutral by 2050 had been at least discussed or presented in that setting was based, at least in part, on the E3 study that was done for Northwest Natural and their carbon neutral framework, that the report from like 2018 or something like that. I didn't know whether it's intended to have the same title as that, and whether it is also linked with that report, or whether it just happens to have that same title.
So it is somewhat based off the UM2178 modeling that we did as a company. I've read that E3 study, but it's been a while, frankly, and I'm not super familiar with the results of that. So any specific ties to the E3 study, I would say are coincidental, probably. Okay. Yeah, it's more so just attempting, the main thing that you'll see when we show the results of it is that graph. We want to get the line to 0. And the way that we're able to do that is, through this blend of resources.
Okay, so the assumptions that were in that report are not necessarily the assumptions that are here.
Correct. I'd imagine there are some similarities, but it's not explicitly. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
You're welcome. Byron.
Yeah, I see that the hydrogen availability, it looks like it's been kind of like dialed up to 30%. Earlier, Brian spoke to 20% being kind of like a maximum bound. Could you kind of talk about that a bit?
Absolutely, and that's a great question, and that's something we're going to include more in the IRP when we talk about. The thing about hydrogen blending right now is it is a very, very nascent technology. So I know Northwest Natural is actually doing some really great work that we are paying close attention to. I think we might even be going to visit one of their facilities where they're doing some tests on this. The short answer is nobody knows how much blending is necessarily going to be safe for certain. There are some studies that have been done that say that blending up to 20% should typically show minimal impacts in terms of safety risk. What we're allowing the model to do by by going to carbon neutral by 2050 is we're assuming that everything needs to be dialed up a little bit, right? So we're going to have to go out and achieve more RNG. We're going to have the availability for more hydrogen. But one thing that you'll see is it's not a requirement, right? So we're not telling the model it has to take 30%. We're just saying you can go as high as that. So in those early years, for instance, when hydrogen is still going to be fairly cost prohibitive, it's not going to select up to that 30%. That's something that we were pretty confident about, knowing what the pricing of hydrogen would be. So we're not going to have to worry about that even being a selected option until we start getting into, say the 2040 period onward, where we forecast that hydrogen could become more cost effective. At that point, we want to be able to model what would our cost potentially be? What would our resource stack? Is it something that our model would potentially want to go up to 30%? And the actionable results that we can get from that is if it does take that 30%, then that may be, as we start getting closer to that period when it maybe does scale up to that 30%, we'll want to really look into that technology to see if that's a feasible thing. It's never going to appear in the 2 to 4 year action plan because frankly, I don't think hydrogen is going to be cost effective in the next 2 to 4 years. I feel fairly confident about that statement, frankly. Things could change. I know there's a lot of investment, but I feel fairly confident that hydrogen is not going to be a significant part of our system in the next 2 to 4 years. So what this helps give us is information. It gives us information as to would an increased hydrogen blend be something that our model may want us to consider? And then once again, using Mark and Brian's favorite term, this just informs, it doesn't decide. So then allows our decision makers to know that, hey, if we were to want to go carbon neutral by 2050 and we were going to, our modeling does indicate that high amounts of hydrogen would be attractive. Is that something that is even technically feasible? Is that a technology we should be investing in? It gives us information, gives us that knowledge to be able to hopefully make future decisions on. And that can be updated in future iterations. Awesome. I think that's everything for this. So then kind of showing some visual results on this on the next slide. So this gives a little bit of an idea of what is the difference versus the base case, right? So the solid blue line is going to be our traditional costs, while the dotted blue line is going to be our total costs. So that's going to include those environmental. So this actually, the gap on that may look familiar. It's going to be a mirror image, at least for scenario 1, of that portfolio 1 chart we saw a couple of slides beforehand. Looking at some of the differences in cost, you'll see scenario 2 shows that, and actually shows a fairly lower cost. And I think we talked about a little bit in the results about that. But that was an interesting kind of result that we saw from this. And it looks like, at least in those later years, it's mostly driven by differences in traditional costs. And then there is a little bit also in those mid years that could be differences from environmental compliance costs. Now I think the next slide kind of talk about some of the key findings about that. Next is just showing what the resource stack is in that. So it does look like hydrogen is a larger part of that blend starting in 2041, 2042, really. And so that kind of gets to Byron's question, right? Is like, what do we learn from this? What we learn from this is that going that far out in the future, hydrogen may be something that, if at all technically possible, we're going to want to get beyond the 20%. Now, once again, there's also other ways that we could do that, right? There's dedicated hydrogen systems. We could end up doing the hydrogen version of a microgrid, for instance, right? Where let's say we had, and this is not anything that's even close to being planned, purely in the theoretical perspective. But let's say we had a new community that was popping up right here in the Tri-Cities, right? We're growing a lot in the Tri-Cities, and let's say a new community popped up and we expected there to be some rather significant growth. If the technology were feasible and the costs were attractive and the ability to get the hydrogen there was feasible, maybe we build a dedicated hydrogen microsystem there, for lack of a better term, where you wouldn't have to worry about blending constraints because everything is hydrogen based. This is stuff that's going to be figured out 15 plus years from now. So we're not making any definitive decisions once again on this. This is just information for us to gain, and we'll be fleshing this out quite a bit in the IRP. So the key takeaways about this, we do believe we'd be able to hit our emissions goal even in a carbon neutral scenario. So that's a big win, right? That's something that, obviously if you're getting more aggressive, is that going to be a concern? In Washington, it may not necessarily be as much of a concern just because, as Brian said, we're pretty confident from talking to our consultants that the allowance marketplace is going to allow us to, as kind of a backstop, be able to hit any compliance goals that we would need. But in Oregon, there is a much larger constraint to the number of compliance instruments you can use. So wanting to know if we can hit our emissions goals was a big question of this, and the result looks like it can. The second one to the conversation we've had is aggressive utilization of green hydrogen would be key to our success in that scenario. So a couple of things that ends up talking about is once again, green hydrogen, what we're seeing in future years is going to be priced rather attractively. I think that's a large reason why that cost delta appears, is if the green hydrogen marketplace manifests as we expect it to, and if everybody kind of, as I would say, a region, even a nation, frankly, with a lot of the federal efforts that are happening with it, if that investment in hydrogen does seem to end up being attractive, we would want to be a major part of that. Once again, that's not a decision we're making today, not even presumably in the next 5 years, but we're going to want to continue to keep an eye on it, see what's going on at the local and federal levels on that. Because ultimately, it may end up being a very large part of our success in a carbon neutral by 2050 scenario. The other thing to keep in note is if market conditions were to manifest as modeled. So the other part of that, Brian, if you go back a slide, the other part of that, back another one, sorry, is that lower traditional cost that you're seeing in 2042 onward. When we model in this, if you go back to, if you remember the sensitivities that we toggle a lower traditional natural gas price. The logic behind this is we would presume that a 2050 carbon neutral effort wouldn't just be us in a vacuum, right? If we were to go towards that, I think a lot of other regional players would start doing that as well. So once again, the logic behind that is if everybody is going towards that, we could see, and this is a qualitative judgment, obviously, that we're making, but I think it would be fair to expect with a lower demand for that traditional natural gas, there could be a fall in that price, which would create a cost savings or cost delta from our base case modeling. It's an interesting result, right? And one that we're definitely going to want to flesh out more when we're writing the narrative of the IRP. But I think it is an interesting delta that could happen where the first thought that we may end up thinking is, oh, well, if we're going to go carbon neutral, it's going to be more expensive. That was at least my assumption when we first kind of started crafting this. And the result could actually be different from that when you really look at how the pieces might interplay with each other. So that's just kind of an example of the kind of analysis we'll do on this scenario, because I think that's a very interesting result that we glean from that. So moving on to scenario 3, and that's that limited RNG availability. So almost kind of the opposite of the 2050 carbon neutral, where instead of it being that we're going to really emphasize RNG and really emphasize hydrogen, let's say our assumptions were not accurate related to RNG. And let's say, in fact, it goes the other way. So let's say that there's too much competition for RNG on a nationwide level or even in a regional level, and we're not able to get what we want. Technology stagnates. We end up having to be conservative when it comes to hydrogen blending. So kind of the flip side of Byron's coin is instead of going up to 30%, what if we have to toggle that hydrogen down to 5%? That's actually another position that some have taken, right? Is that 5% blending by volume of hydrogen might be the only real safe way to do it. The answer is nobody knows at this point. There's still tons of studies going on. Everybody's doing their own analysis. So all we can do is model different sensitivities relating to this. And so this is an important one to model also. What happens if we have to go to that lower 5%? What also happens if we have a lower amount of RNG? You know, we make some pretty aggressive assumptions about what we think we're going to ultimately end up with on RNG. What if we can't get that much? Customer growth would stay the same in this. One thing we would almost certainly have to do is increase our amount of energy efficiency. We're going to have to make that investment in energy efficiency if we're going to be successful in a lower RNG situation. So we're going to show higher CPAs using a higher avoided cost. We talked a little bit about that in prior tags, how we ended up using kind of a weighted price of RNG and hydrogen in that higher CPA analysis. Natural gas bands would stay the same. And the traditional gas price would, the price would be the traditional. I don't recall offhand, we'll include it, that last line, I apologize. I don't remember if we ended up using a higher price for RNG or not, but we will make sure to document the final assumption on that in the IRP. So looking at the cost of this, once again, that blue line is the traditional cost, and the green lines, or blue line is the solid lines are traditional costs. The dotted lines include environmental reduction costs. You'll see on this one, the major cost difference on this is in later years, costs go up. That's kind of to be expected, right? We're losing access to some of those lower cost resources. So we're going to have to start digging into some higher costs. Interestingly, we see lower environmental compliance costs on it. That ends up being, I believe, actually a little caveat on this, and we'll talk about it. I think we may end up having some challenges to hit environmental compliance goals in this scenario. And we'll talk about what that could mean for us in terms of if this is a portfolio that needs to be continued to be considered or not. But I think that's the main reason for that lower in total cost, which is a lower environmental cost. We can go on to the next slide though and talk about that. So this is Washington's resource stack. Once again, with lower hydrogen, you see that green sliver is a much smaller sliver at this point. In Washington, RNG is not a major part of the solution, so you don't see much of a change in RNG, and auctions becomes a even more heavily considered resource. But if you go to Oregon, on the next slide, this is where you'll see, yeah, the challenge that we've run into. So starting in 2040, all of a sudden, having a lower amount of RNG have access to, we would have some challenges to hit our environmental compliance goals. Also, having lower hydrogen is another challenge that we run into. And you see ultimately that gap starting in 2040 being a cause for concern. And that's something that we're going to talk about on the next slide and definitely in more detail in the IRP itself. So we do believe that we would be able to hit our emissions reduction goals in Washington, but we would be challenged to be successful in meeting our goals in Oregon. So the way I look at it is this. The things that would really challenge us to not being comfortable with a portfolio is if in our action plan period, we're not able to hit our emissions reduction goals. So once again, in that 2 to 4 year period, if any kind of scenario analysis would cause us to not be able to hit our goals, that I think would be a reason to reject a portfolio. Since the shortfalls begin in 2040, I don't think it needs to be a reason to reject the portfolio itself, but rather to learn information from it. And the biggest thing that we learn from it is we're going to have to be aggressive in our pursuit of RNG. Not having access to the amount of RNG that we model having will cause problems for us and could end up causing challenges for us to hit our compliance goals. That's, I think, the key takeaway from this particular scenario. And the other thing is, while we're in compliance, the costs were higher, not prohibitively so, though. So the higher cost that we talked about, we're losing access to some of those lower cost resources, that lower cost RNG, lower cost hydrogen, not having access to those and having to supplement it with higher cost resources. Presumably it would be in Oregon higher cost allowances, for instance, or CCIs. When CCIs are higher than RNG, we'd have to invest in that resource. That would ultimately give us some issues in terms of cost deltas, but not prohibitively so. Like you said, the difference did not seem to be significant and a reason to want to reject the portfolio. Kim, I see you have a question.
Thanks. So it does seem misleading is too strong of a word, but with the decrease in total cost in the scenario 3, that dotted lines starting in 2040 that are associated with that non-compliance, it does make more sense to capture some proxy for the a non-compliant scenario. I don't mean to suggest that that's a path that you would consider, but just enough discussion around that to show that this isn't actually a cost reduction from that base case, because you do have a non-compliance cost associated with it, or you would.
I agree with you on that.
I agree with you on that,
and I think this came up in our discussions once again, and I talked a little bit about it earlier today when we were kind of talking about what do we do in that spot. I remember, and you or maybe somebody else could correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the penalties are rather dramatic. But I mean, frankly, I think, there's a reason for that, right? I'm not editorializing when I say dramatic, but I think they are rather steep. Once again, not editorializing on that, but it's something like $10 per day per metric ton, I believe, of non-compliance. And so when we put that, because I did model that, and when we put that in, it skyrockets the cost to a number that nothing else is even visible because the scale is just so dramatically different. It blows up the axis and you can't see anything about it. I'm interested in some feedback from you or others as to what could potentially be a way to do that. The plan I think that we had was including just in the narrative, in these scenario analyses, there's going to be a rather substantive, I would imagine, a couple of paragraphs, if not a page, on each scenario. And in that, I would imagine we'll talk about just that, the things that I've just said in terms of what the dollar amounts would potentially be, that's not something we're going to consider. I think the visuals can still be useful, although I agree that that is a somewhat misleading visual. Perhaps similar to the other ones, we put a caveat on it where we say that, note that these costs are related to non-compliance. And then in the textual portion of it, we can talk about that further, but I'm interested in what you or others, if there are any alternatives that you'd consider us, or maybe there's a cost that we're not familiar with that would be worth modeling in that situation.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I think certainly having that in the narrative is valuable. I think having one example of sort of the blowing up of the visual might be helpful context, but I do think also that might be valuable to get a little more guidance from our Department of Environmental Quality on sort of what that range of that cost ought to be, because frankly it's not clear to us, but I do think there's an issue of like, if you're going to approximate it, having something that seems realistic is going to be valuable, and I'm not sure what that realistic value is yet.
Yeah, I think that's the exact challenge we had too, right? Is because at that, I don't expect that Cascade would ever say, oh, we're just going to continue to take $10,000 per metric ton per day and just eat that, because it would be astronomical. That being said, and maybe we do try to have a conversation with ecology, we can definitely take a note about that. Maybe we do have a conversation with ecology and say, from modeling perspectives, what, not that we ever expect to be in non-compliance, but what could be something to look at in that regard, and maybe they can give us a number that would be more realistic. And if there is nothing else, then I do like your idea also of including one of those charts as a kind of visual example of why it's not included, maybe even a with or without, to show that why the other charts don't look like this. I think that can be helpful.
Great. Thanks, Devin.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. That was really useful, Kim. I muted myself, sorry. So moving on to scenario 4, increase electrification. So once again, I'm going to emphasize in this scenario, these are not what we expect to happen. These are not what we're advocating for. We're not advocating against either. This is just an analysis of what ifs. But we did want to model this because I think it's extremely important to have the conversation and look at what the results are. It was something we did in UM 2178. We found value in it, and I think there is value in it here as well, talking about it from a holistic perspective. So the main element of this is we have lower than expected load projections due to both discretionary electrification and increased regulatory bans. So the growth is the major toggle in this, and this came straight from our UM 2178 modeling. The growth in our residential and commercial counts gradually slows to zero growth in 2025, and then afterwards our residential and commercial customer counts reduced to 10%, not by, to 10% by 2050. So a large part of our customer base essentially goes away by the end of the modeling horizon. Energy efficiency would end up using the higher CPA projections simply because that would certainly be a part of how all of this would happen in conjunction with electrification. Another way that our growth would be reduced is by further investments in energy efficiency, presumably. RNG availability wouldn't change, hydrogen wouldn't change. The natural gas bans, this is where we're including all of those bans because that's going to be a major driver in electrification. And we're also going to assume a lower price forecast. This variable really ended up being a lot more impactful than I initially expected. But it makes sense though, right? Like our total costs are going to go down if the price of what we're buying ultimately ends up being a lot lower. That's something that's really good information to have. And so I do think that every time we've made that adjustment, I think it's correct. Because if you look at a situation like this, increased electrification wouldn't just impact Cascade, it would impact the entire region. Everybody in the Pacific Northwest or whoever is going to be impacted by electrification is going to be buying less gas, less traditional gas. So demand at Sumis, at the Rockies, at ACO is going to go down. Those prices are going to fall without those demand drivers keeping them up. So that I think it's fair, and I think it's a really interesting variable, an interesting sensitivity that I kind of glossed over when we first did it, but I'm happy we did do it because I think it's really been impactful in this analysis. So going over to the next slide, Brian. So kind of showing the difference in this, you'll see, unsurprisingly, costs are a lot lower. So even the traditional cost is lower. And once again, that gets to, well, two factors. One, the lower price, but I think more importantly, we have less customers to serve. Also, our emissions costs are dramatically lower, and that's because we don't have nearly as many emissions. So we can really just rely on the lowest of low-hanging fruit in terms of hitting our emissions reduction goals. Doing it with the least cost, with the lowest cost resources as possible to make it to hit that and show those lower costs. Now, one thing I'm going to talk about in the next slide is that's not the total picture, right? Those costs are going to go somewhere. And I think this is the most important element of this slide or of this entire scenario is making sure that whoever looks at this, and whenever we have these electrification conversations, there needs to be a holistic analysis. And that's not something Cascade can do on its own. That's going to have to be a regional effort. And this has been talked about in UM 2178. It's been talked about in Washington. Any electrification efforts are going to have to be talked about holistically with a full regional impact analysis done as to what's going to happen to those to whom the load is shifted onto. Kim, I see you have a question. Or
yeah, maybe you'll get to that, get to this, but as part of that cost impact, I think one of the things we tried to capture in 2178 was how that manifested in a bill impact for different customers and potential impacts of, spreading infrastructure costs over fewer customers, that whole conversation. Is that something that you're going to try to tackle here as well?
I'm not going to be able to get to it here just because we haven't gotten to it yet, frankly, but it is one thing we absolutely will include, as Brian said, in the IRP. Rate impacts are a vital part of the IRP now. I think they're even in the rules, is we have to do rate impacts. And it's important, too, to be able to have that conversation to see what customer rate impacts would be. And kind of to your point, that tells more of the whole story on this as well. We just time constraints, the various other things we've been working on, we haven't had a chance to get to rate impacts yet, but they will absolutely be a part of the IRP.
Okay, and then just to be clear, I think the rate impact is one thing. I think the bill impact is also like another way of looking at it that's informative to stakeholders, because I think it's sort of, that's sort of what the rate impact doesn't necessarily capture, I think, how that manifests for customers. So anyway, the distinction that, maybe you don't, I'd be curious to see how you want to tackle that or whether you can tackle that.
I have a feeling my ignorance about regulatory matters is showing here because I'm not super familiar with the difference between rate impacts and bill impacts. Frankly, I think I've been using the terms interchangeably. But that's something that we will make sure we run by our regulatory folks and use the correct terms and put the correct analysis in there, because that's absolutely something that I'm not familiar with the difference between the two.
Great. Okay. Happy to
But
chat
we
more about it.
We'll have people far more intelligent than I am about those things. Make sure that that's being done properly.
Thanks, Devin.
You bet. All right, so next slide. Showing what the stack looks like. Once again, we're seeing less need in Washington for some of the more expensive resources. So, we're able to, in those later years, particularly as auction prices are expecting to go up, we don't have to be as aggressive in our participation in those auctions now. One thing we didn't model, but that would also be presumably a part of this, is if the entire region had less goals, I would imagine those auctions are going to manifest differently. The challenge with that is, I will be entirely honest, once again, I don't think anybody knows how those auctions are going to ultimately end up going in Washington. It's still such a new process that I think we would be very hesitant to make any kind of qualitative adjustments to what the auction pricing would end up being without having at least had participation in one auction. So I think that would be a good action item for future IRPs, is in a scenario like this, we can adjust what those auction prices would be with lower participation. But I am certainly afraid, and I think many of us are, to even dip our toe into trying to speculate what could happen in those auctions, because it's an entirely new process for all of us modelers. So I think we're going to keep a close eye on that. And when we have more information, I think one thing that all modelers like to do is have some experience to be able to project out on. Without having that, I think we're going to be challenged to make any sort of blind qualitative assessments. But we can certainly identify it as an action item for future IRPs, is to use information we learn from getting our feet wet with a couple of auctions and be able to make better sensitivity analyses on what would happen in those auctions after we learn more. So the key takeaways for this one, the obvious picture that we see is increased electrification would make compliance with our goals far easier, right? We're going to have less emissions. We don't have to be as aggressive in our auctions. In Oregon, we, obviously we're still going to pursue RNG, but we don't need to be nearly as aggressive in our RNG acquisition. And we'll talk more about that in the Tag 5 Oregon slides, where we can see what the visuals look like for that. But I would presume we're going to see a lot less RNG being taken in Oregon, just because we don't have to now. So that's going to make that a lot easier. This next point I absolutely want to emphasize, which is why I bolded and underlined it. The cost for electrification, and these are just costs, once again, not any kind of rate or bill impacts, but the costs are significantly lower to Cascade. This is a result of those costs ended up being shifted elsewhere. Before any policy decisions can be made on this, an apples to apples comparison of what the cost increases to customers would what the resulting cost increases to customers must be performed. So that gets to your point, Kim. We ultimately would want to look at what those bill impacts would be to customers before anybody could say that this is definitively a positive. And then the other thing is, once again, I think a regional analysis of what ends up being the impact to those who have to pick up the load, because they're going to have their own environmental compliance goals that they're going to have to comply with. They're already presumably taking the lowest cost resources to do everything that they're trying to do. If they were to have a whole lot of more load shifted onto them, presumably they're going to have to start acquiring higher cost resources. And so that delta between what our resource cost might be and what their resource cost might be is an important analysis to be done on a regional level to make sure that we can really get a true understanding of what the cost is, not just looking at it as a vacuum for Cascade or its other LDCs that, oh, electrification looks great, you're not having to pay as much. Well, that needs to be a full holistic analysis that's done first. The overall kind of summary to that is lower costs do not necessarily reflect lower rates to customers. Kind of getting into, once again, what Kim was talking about, lower customer counts could lead to higher cost per customers. We're going to do that rate impact. And once again, this is my naivete because I wrote this. And also that bill impact. All of that will need to be included in the final IRP so we can present what that impact will be to fully inform our stakeholders what would be the full picture of this scenario analysis. And once again, it's important to note that we're not saying necessarily that we're going to be making decisions immediately on this. It's just important to get these scenarios modeled and get an idea of what we're looking at so that if the future does manifest in a certain direction, we have experience having modeled this already. Byron, I see you have a question.
Yeah, I think that this scenario is probably one of the more interesting ones, and it raises a lot of questions about how it could actually be done. And so I wonder, like, let's say that we have a community in which, say, hypothetically, like 90% of the community goes electric, and you still have 10% that's still getting gas. But it makes that leg of your service territory unprofitable. How would you guys, I guess, make sure that you meet that demand, but then also meeting the financial aspect of making those numbers crunch out? Like, it seems like you would end up having potentially like stranded customers, or stranded assets, or just kind of like, you know, if you install a new pipeline, then it gets electrified in that area. You may not be able to like amortize those costs. And so I feel there's a lot of more of a financial and a technical kind of aspect to how this scenario would actually play out. And are you guys going to try and look into that a bit more in the IRP, or?
I think that's a great point. I think what the IRP will absolutely need to do is identify all of those risks, right? And kind of have some conversation about that. To some of your points, though, I think when we model, for instance, the 90% reduction, because like, so the way we model is more on kind of that regional perspective. I don't think it would end up actually manifesting the way that you're talking about. I think it would more so be in a certain region. So like when we transport gas, for instance, right? And we've talked about this in like tag 2 or tag 3. The main challenge for us is we need to get upstream gas to a specific pipeline zone within like Northwest Pipe, right? So talking about Washington, for instance, any gas that we can get to this Tri-Cities region, I think that's zone 10 or zone 11, I always forget, can then be sent to any of the communities or city gates within that region. I expect what would end up happening in practice is that 90% would be manifested as these communities within that zone have 100% gone electrification while this community has not. And that ends up making the 10% versus 90% in that kind of situation. However, I think qualitatively, I don't think it's possible to do that level of quantitative analysis on it just yet, because there are so many what ifs that could happen with that. But qualitatively identifying those risks will be an important part of identifying, discussing this scenario. Because I think if it, like you said, there are so many things that could pop up when talking about the quantitatives about, you know, what could happen with stranded assets once again, what could happen. The other issue that we run into is Cascade has an obligation to serve. And so it's statutory. If customers want gas, we have to serve them gas. You know, we may even need to get our legal team involved, frankly, when talking about this as to what would be the result of this. But at least my understanding of it, and somebody, Mark or Brian, please correct me if I'm wrong about this, but my understanding is because we have that obligation to serve, even in a situation where it might not theoretically be profitable, I think we do have to serve those customers because of our franchise agreement, frankly. We have that obligation to serve. I think we do have to serve them. So that's another factor that comes into it. I think, you know, we can try to include as much financial analysis as we can on this scenario, but the numerous number of what ifs, I think, would be too extensive. But one thing we actually will do is try to identify in terms of talking about qualitatively what those risks are. I think that will absolutely be a part of the IRP. Because one thing that's also important is, while the IRP is to some extent a technical document, and it is, there are technical analyses, it also needs to be accessible to the general public. This is a public document that if somebody were to pick it up, they need to be able to read it and understand it. And I think for those individuals, it's much more valuable to have that qualitative risk discussion versus 30 pages of calculations as to what the potential financial risks could be. that I do think would be an important part of that regional discussion that we talked about, that I mentioned rather. I think if that were to continue to move forward and there wanted to be a regional analysis on it, I would make sure to inform people that would certainly be an important part of that regional analysis, though. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it's a really complex like scenario. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Absolutely. I agree with you 100%. I'm going to go ahead and predict that it's going to be the most lengthy scenario discussion in the IRP, because I think there's so much to talk about with it. All right. So high customer growth. This is something we've always modeled, and it is important to do that analysis. Ashton is one of the best forecasters that I've ever met, but he does not have a crystal ball. We could end up having higher than expected customer growth. Once again, we do have that obligation to serve that I just talked about. So what this allows us to potentially try to figure out is, what if our growth is higher than expected? Can we still hit those emissions reduction goals? Do we still have the upstream transportation that we would need? Kind of Brian talked a little bit about that in the as-is modeling, right? Like, do we have the ability to serve them in the first place? Because we once again have that obligation to serve. And then do we have the ability to do it with our emissions reduction requirements? And then is it cost prohibitive? Those are all the things we want to try to gather as the results of this scenario. So the growth would be on Ashton's high growth forecast projection for the 2023 IRP. Energy efficiency would be the higher energy efficiency once again. We're also going to crank up some of those renewables variables, excuse me, in this one. So higher RNG availability, higher hydrogen availability, same gas bands, and an increase in both traditional natural gas price and RNG above and beyond what we would expect to need. The logic behind this, once again, being, I don't think high growth would be localized to Cascade. If we were to have high growth, I would expect it to be a regional thing. Certainly certain pockets could end up having high growth, but if it was an entire systemic high growth, that would be a regional thing. So everybody would be needing to buy more gas. That would presumably lead to higher prices. And then the higher RNG, anything above what we expect, we'd have to be super competitive on. We've lost the low-hanging fruit. So that's why we use the higher price for that. And so here's the results. So as you can see, once again, the traditional cost, it's that same curve. The total costs on this scenario, you can see the traditional costs are actually a little bit lower. I think we talked about, we'll talk about in the next slide why that is. I don't remember off the top of my head, frankly. It might be that we're buying less traditional gas and more renewables. So that the traditional cost, which really is just how much we're paying for gas at Sumas, Rockies, ACO, it's going to be lower, because the costs at for the environmental compliance, so that's the green dotted line, is a lot higher. Once again, I don't believe that to be prohibitively higher. I think, if you look at it percentage wise, even at the highest point, it's less than, or it's about a 10% cost increase. A little bit more than a 10% cost increase, actually, which is significant. But when we've done a lot of our value at risk modeling in the past, I think usually 25% increases are what really toggle concern for our higher ups or gas supply oversight committee and those folks. So a 10% increase, 10% plus, while significant, I don't think would ultimately result in rejection of the portfolio. Looking at the resource stack. So you can see that we are once again able to hit our compliance goals in Washington. Having the ability to be participants in those auctions is going to be a major part of that. And then once again, cranking up that hydrogen starting in, I think, a little bit earlier this time. It starts in like 2039. And then maximizing utilization of that will be a key part of hitting our goals with higher customer counts. So going to the next slide. So we're pleased to see that we're able to meet our customer demand and reach our emissions reduction goals on a high growth scenario. As I stated when we started this, that's kind of the biggest flags when it came to this scenario analysis is if growth is higher, do we still have that transportation ability to meet our customer demand? And are we able to hit our emissions compliance goals? And we are with that. That aggressive participation in the Washington allowance auctions, including the use of price ceiling allowances when needed, is going to be vital to our success if we do see higher growth, along with aggressive RNG acquisition in Oregon. And we'll talk about that in tag 5, that in a lot of the Oregon's specific visuals, RNG is the major thing that moves up and down. Being that that's not a big part of Washington, it's going to be allowances is going to be the biggest mover in these scenario toggles. And that's just something, once again, I know I keep preaching this, but participation and knowledge about these Washington auctions is going to be so important for Cascade's success. You know, we're continually watching these webinars that are being held on registering for the auctions and what the process can be. We hired a consultant who's helping us come up with strategy on it. We're going to make sure that we are prepared to be as successful as we can be when it comes to these auctions, because I think we're going to need to be if we want to be successful in our compliance with emissions reduction goals. So as expected, overall costs are going to be higher in our high growth scenario, and that's going to be increased costs related to emissions reduction requirements. But they don't appear to be cost prohibitive under our deterministic modeling. Now, I caveat that with deterministic modeling. As Brian said, we've had some challenges with trying to get our stochastic modeling fully done at this point. We're going to have to so I just realized also there's a comment that they were not consistent y-axes. I apologize for that. I will make sure that we fix that for the next tag meeting and in the actual IRP. That is a good call. Thank you for calling that out. And once again, did not mean to be disingenuous with that by any means. It was an honest mistake, but we will absolutely fix that. Anyway, yeah, so we have had some troubles with our stochastic modeling at this point. So it's a very challenging process dealing with the new optimization software. I'm sure some of our friends from our other regional LDCs would echo that sentiment. Getting the stochastic modeling done has been challenging. And that will be an interesting thing to review for this is under a 99th percentile or 95th percentile of pricing, for instance, what does the cost difference end up being? And granted, those stochastic results are only weighted at 25%, but that still is an important consideration, right? If there's one thing that anybody who's been paying attention to the gas markets now would see, crazy things have been happening. We've seen price swings 30% in a 2-week period going both directions. That's significant. And that's something that shows that stochastic modeling is very important. So we're going to want to make sure that once we get that stochastic modeling done, we look at what the impact ends up being to those costs. And if it is prohibitive, we may need to make adjustments as appropriate. And we will, of course, let everybody know what adjustments, if any, are made. Thank you, Sebastian, for echoing the sentiment once again. Yes, I knew we had some friends at Northwest Natural on this call, and I had a feeling that they have felt our pain as well when it comes to that. So thank you. This final scenario, I think, second to the electrification scenario, might be the other one most interesting to me, because it's kind of unique. We've never really done anything like this. We've done things similar to this, but I thought it was kind of a cool idea that we came up with, where it's this interrupted supply leading to a high price scenario. And so you may remember when we went over our scenarios before, the main elements of this is that there will be indiscriminate stochastically derived incidences causing disruptions in availability of geologic gas at specific basins. What does that mean? So over the planning horizon, 28 years or so, we just did a simple stochastic process where it would be, okay, you do a random chance of, not a random, but a defined chance of an incident happening, right? So let's say it's year one, there's a lower probability, 20% or so chance that there could be an incident at any one of our 3 basins. If an incident does happen, prices spike all the way up to our 99th percentile, And the amount of volumes that are lost is also stochastically defined. It can be anywhere from 50% to 100% of supplies being cut off at that particular basin. Prices at the other basins also end up spiking because there is such correlation in our territory. If there's no gas at Sumas, everybody's buying gas at Rockies. That's just what ends up happening. So then if an incident happens, we model it taking 2 years to linearly regress back to what the normal availability would be. So every month we get back, if things went up, if we lost 50%, let's say, of our supply because of one incident, then every month we gain back a little bit more than 2% supply availability every month until the 2-year period is completed, and then everything's operating back to normal, and then we run random chances again. So over the course of the 28-year planning horizon, I think 3 incidences are what ends up happening, and so we show what ends up happening where, supply's been called off at Sumas. Are we able to maneuver through our other basins to serve our load, and what's the impact to our costs from that happening? So that's kind of how that ended up going. We have some visuals that'll kind of show that coming up in a couple of slides. But that's the main element, right? Those are the visuals, but I'll go over the elements again of it. And most of this hasn't changed, right? Growth stays the same. Energy efficiency stays the same. RNG availability, hydrogen bans, all of that stays the same. It's just the price that's really the major change, and then the resulting supply availability. So now we can go to the next one. So here's some cool little visuals. First on the left, you have what ends up happening with price. So orange is ACO, gray is Rockies, blue is Sumas, and that's consistent among these. So you have dollars per decatherm on the left one, and the actual supply MDQs on the right one. And these are just, if you remember from way back in our process, we have the supply stacks. And so there's different types of resources we have. So at each basin, ACOs, Rockies, and Sumas, there's fixed resources, there's index resources, there's peak resources. For just visual purposes, we're just showing the fixed resources here. Although, once again, it's important to note that the I'll look into this in a second. Okay, it's important to note that the other resources are impacted as well, right? So if we lose ACO fixed, we also lose ACO index, we also lose ACO peak. We just have no accessibility or limited accessibility to ACO for that period. So we have 3 incidences that happen. The first one is in Rockies, that happens in 2028. The second one is in Sumas, that happens in 2034, and then the third one in ACO in 2046. So now this is only showing what the mix is for fixed. Once again, some other resources, so like the winter supplies may end up not showing a full decrease, because the percentages were variable. And we'll talk about, we'll kind of show for transparency what the full resulting changes were for all resources, but just visually, this is what one resource looked like. So we see a bottom out at Rockies in the early period, at Sumas in the mid period, and ACO in the late period. What I found most interesting about this is you'll see, if you look at Sumas pricing, so in the middle period, Sumas pricing is the most dramatically affected, not surprising because the incident happens at Sumas. In the early period, Rockies is the one that's most dramatically affected. In the late period, you'll see, once again, Sumas is the highest impacted period. And the reason for that is volatility. Sumas is by far the most volatile basin that not by far, Rockies is also fairly volatile, but Sumas is far more volatile than ACO in terms of its pricing. When it moves, it moves. And anybody that's been following it in this period has seen, once again, those 30% swings are mostly happening at Sumas. So when looking at those percentile of impacts, if a pricing event happens at ACO, the correlated pricing at Sumas, even though it wasn't a 99th percentile event, is still going to move rather dramatically. And you'll see it moved even higher than ACO. That just is because of the insane volatility. It's also the fact that it's further out, right? gas prices in the future have higher volatility than prices in the shorter term. We can be fairly confident we know what the gas prices are going to be tomorrow based on forwards. I don't think anybody has any idea what prices are going to actually be in 2046. So because you have that higher volatility, there's more room for extreme spikes to happen. And because Sumis is more volatile, when an incident even happens in AGO, it's Sumis that sees the most dramatic spike. So that's just a little thing that I found interesting that I wanted to kind of display with this visual. So looking at the differences in cost, right? Unsurprisingly, almost the entire related movements are because an incident happens at a basin, right? So you see the three little humps. The one in the future is a little bit less. I think we ended up losing less supply in that one particular random draw. But the first two are the more significant little humps that happen in, once again, 2028 and then 2034, and that translates up to a higher total cost. The emissions costs, I think, are fairly unchanged, if I think entirely unchanged in these. It's really just the cost of the traditional gas. Environmental compliance, SAC, I don't think this changed at all. We're still going to be looking at RNG in Oregon. We're still going to be looking at auctions in Washington, some hydrogen. Actually, no, there is an interesting note in this. You will see that in 2034, there is some hydrogen picked up, and we'll actually talk about this on the next slide. This, in my opinion, is one of the coolest takeaways from this scenario modeling is, you know, I've talked a lot about the hydrogen cost effectiveness being the biggest challenge towards its acquisition, right? I've seen right now projections for hydrogen are around anywhere from $20 to $25 per decatherm. So nobody is reasonably buying hydrogen at this point unless those prices were to fall. However, if even by that mid period, right? So if it's declining at a fairly reasonable clip, by that mid 2030s, it should be, if I remember correctly, don't quote me on this, somewhere in the teens, low teens maybe. So it's getting close to being cost effective, unless a major event happens. If a major pricing shock were to happen at Sumis, for instance, all of a sudden hydrogen might actually be the cost-effective resource when compared to $20 Sumis gas. That's a really interesting takeaway for this, and something that I frankly never would have even thought of before doing this scenario modeling is some of those resources, and that applies to RNG too. Some of those green resources that may have challenges related to pricing under expected conditions, having resiliency and somewhat of certainty, even especially if you were to have a contract. Now, you know, you could have a landfill that all of a sudden stops producing for whatever reason. It has a glitch, something goes wrong. There are challenges to that, but there certainly is some certainty towards an RNG production, at least also from a pricing perspective, right? You know, I don't want to get too far into this. I know we're coming up towards lunchtime, but RNG is essentially a hedge. It's a fixed price contract for the most part. Sometimes you can have it tied to an index, but if you have a fixed price contract or if you build an RNG project, you have certainty related to that price, and that certainty is valuable. So it's another kind of feather in the cap for those resources, is that pricing certainty can be even more valuable when looking at resiliency in comparison to some of these extreme event happenings. I think the next slide kind of summarizes a lot of what I just said. So, okay, this is another key point that I think will be interesting to talk about. We're able to meet our emissions reduction targets, but we did identify potential shortfall in serving our load during that 2034 modeled Sumis incident. So where that hydrogen was taken, I think we actually did have a demand shortfall. This was super interesting to me as well, right? In theory, this could be a problem. We do have an obligation to serve. And so if in a vacuum, if we're unable to get that Sumis gas and our modeling is showing us that we're not able to get that Sumis gas, that could be a problem. However, one thing that's really interesting is we can look back on history and see what has happened in a situation like that. Those may recall in, I think it was 2018 or 2019, there was an Enbridge explosion. And that restricted a significant amount of the gas that North America, or that the United States, was able to get from Canada, from that specific Sumis region when that Enbridge explosion happened. some really cool stuff happened. And obviously that incident was tragic, but there's a lot of resiliency within our system. There are these programs that I know some of our gas supply folks may be more knowledgeable to be able to talk about, and we're going to include narrative about this, about how the region ends up helping each other out, where people end up utilizing other people's storages and help balance each other to make sure that in these incidences we don't lose customers. Because when these things happen, the entire region has to work together as a team. And that ends up happening. And the 2018-2019 incident, while certainly tragic, ended up also being a gigantic success for our region, because I don't believe, I'm fairly certain we didn't lose customers, and I don't think anybody did. And that's a great takeaway that the model itself can't identify, because it doesn't have that human element to it of the region working together and everybody kind of helping each other out towards serving that load. So that's going to be, I think, a very valuable narrative to include in this, that while on paper there may be incidences, we have ways to overcome that, and we can talk about that in the narrative. I think that's actually a really cool thing that this identifies, and it gives us a chance to talk about those resiliency efforts that happen as a region. The other major takeaway, I already talked about this, I'm not going to belabor the point, is our participation in those hydrogen markets, right? In current conditions, it probably wouldn't be in the 2030 period, but as soon as pricing spikes, maybe we end up engaging in some short-term hydrogen contracts in that period and blending it. It's a possibility. It's something to keep an eye on as we keep an eye on those pricing and, once again, those incidences. As expected, costs will be higher during those price shock incidences, but they're not as significantly as I initially expected, right? I was afraid that when $20 Sumas gas manifested, we'd really shock the portfolio, but we do have that resiliency of being able to buy from some of the other basins, which would be impacted, but maybe not as much so. Also, a large part of our portfolio, once again, talking about that value of the green resources, the value of RNG and hydrogens, many times those are fixed resources. Those prices don't change when traditional gas spikes happen. That's going to end up helping insulate our portfolio versus maybe in a past IRP when those price spikes happen and our costs shoot way up. That doesn't happen as much anymore because we have that insulation and protection from RNG. That's a really good takeaway. I think that's important to, once again, tout the benefits of RNG in situations like this, as well as energy efficiency, frankly. That's another certainty that I think has value. So I think that's all I've got. If there are any questions, definitely let me know. And as always, if there's anything you want to talk about offline, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to.
All right, thanks, Devin. So I'm going to go into the proposed 2-year action plan. And these may be tweaked a little bit for the final narrative. We may add a couple more, but this is what we have currently. 2-year action plan. For the demand forecast, we'll be incorporating end-use forecasting, the load forecast model. One big thing that we've been noticing recently is building code changes that impact certain appliances or certain parts of different customers, and so we want to be able to make sure we incorporate that in our forecast. One thing I forgot to mention on here is we'll also be looking at income levels for our load forecast model as well. And then we did include price as a variable, but I think we just used the traditional natural gas for that. So we'll be looking at tweaking that price elasticity in future IRPs. As for avoided cost, investigate incorporating a separate avoided cost for transportation customers. That way we can look at DSM for the non-core. And then as for the avoided costs, we will be exploring how environmental compliance costs from the Climate Commitment Act and the Climate Protection Plan impact the avoided costs. Demand side management, these were provided in the previous IRP, and so I just pulled them from there. EM&V, new CPA, which will be completed in 2023. Looking at municipal gas bans, code changes, low income, adaptive management. Looks like we have, oh, yeah, go ahead, Monica.
Hi, I just wanted to confirm the CPA for 2023. It's going to start at the end of 2023. It'll be completed for the 2023 biennial conservation plan. So it'll be completed actually in 2024, but the work will be started in 2023.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. In terms of compliance, so our action plan for the compliance is we're going to acquire the number of offsets and allowances needed to meet compliance under the Climate Commitment Act. We're going to acquire on-system RNG. This is a system resource that will be utilized in both Oregon and Washington. And then continue to participate in the local climate community action plans around Cascade service territory. We had a very good conversation with the city of Bend yesterday. This is in Oregon, but we look forward to continuing those local discussions. And then in terms of distribution system planning, we are going to be looking at eight different projects across Washington, Kitsap, Aberdeen, Bellingham, Richland, South Kennewick, Pasco, Burlington, and Wapato. Monica, did you have another comment or question? I see your hand still up.
No, I'm sorry. I'll just put it down.
No problem. Are there any questions on the 2-year action plan? Okay. So we have the remaining schedule. We will be holding Tag 5 Oregon November 9th. So that's coming up pretty soon. If you're interested in it, it'll be very similar to this presentation, but it'll be for the climate protection program instead of the Climate Commitment Act. And then we'll be filing the draft IRP. So the draft IRP for Washington will be right before Thanksgiving, November 23rd. For Oregon, it will be January 5th. And then we're given about 6 weeks for comments for stakeholders. There's a lot of information in here. We want to give at least 6 weeks. That way people can read through the narrative, send us questions before. You can reach out at any point between then if you have any questions on the draft. You don't have to wait until when comments are due to ask us questions. Oregon, February 24th for comments due back. And then we'll hold a Tag 6 right after we get those comments. If there are any questions, anything you want us to clarify, if you want us to talk about something that was missed in the tag meetings further, we can definitely do that. And then we will be filing the final IRP. Washington will be February 24th. And Oregon will be April 14th. So just letting everyone know what the next steps are for Oregon. We will be discussing Tag 5 Wednesday, November 9th. That will have the final integration results, finalization of plan components, and the action plan. Oh, and we will also be having a presentation on distribution system planning in Tag 5 in Oregon. And then for Washington, the draft will be filed Wednesday, November 23rd. All right, this is where I'm going to put this up. There's our contact information. Please reach out to us if you have any questions. If you want a walkthrough of anything, feel free to reach out. We're more than willing to get together, set up a meeting, and discuss things. With that said, if there are no questions, we'll let people go, but I'm gonna keep this open. Feel free to ask questions. If I don't see any questions after 2 or 3 minutes, I'll close the the meeting down.
Just take a second to say thank you very much for your time today, y'all.
Yeah. Are there any, is there anyone that has any closing comments that they want to make? Questions? Everyone's just ready for lunch. I think thanks to all of you. This IRP definitely takes some back and forth between external stakeholders and a lot of work. Thanks to all the people within Cascade to put together a good IRP, and look forward to continue this process with the draft and getting comments back. But I'm not seeing any questions. I don't see any hands up, so I'll let everyone go get some lunch, and we'll be in contact, and look out for the draft IRP in about a month. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Brian.